The morning sun streaked through the tall windows of Reed Manor, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Elena Vasquez stood at the iron gates, her worn backpack clutched tightly to her chest. The sprawling estate looked even more intimidating up close than it had in the photographs. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, straightening her simple blouse. It's just another job, but they both knew it wasn't. The position at Reed Manor paid triple what she'd earned at the hotel. Money she desperately needed. The intercom crackled. "State your business," a crisp voice demanded. "Elena Vasquez. I'm the new household assistant. Mrs. Porter is expecting me." After a pause that felt longer than it probably was, the massive gates swung open with a mechanical hum. Elena took a deep breath and walked up the curved driveway, trying not to gawk at the perfectly manicured gardens surrounding her. Mrs. Porter, the head housekeeper, waited at the entrance. A thin woman with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. She greeted Elena with a quick nod. "You're 3 minutes early." "Good. We value punctuality above all else in this household." Her eyes moved critically over Elena's appearance. "Your resume indicated extensive experience in luxury establishments." "Yes, ma'am. 5 years at the Grand Plaza Hotel, and Mr. Reed's standards exceed any hotel," Mrs. Porter interrupted. "Follow me." Elena followed the older woman through a maze of hallways, trying to memorize the layout while absorbing Mrs. Porter's rapid-fire instructions. Staff entrance only, never the front door. Meals in the kitchen quarters. Working hours are 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. with Sundays half-days. Mr. Reed requires absolute silence when he's working. No personal calls during hours. Uniform must be spotless at all times. They paused before a small room tucked at the end of a service corridor. "Your quarters," Mrs. Porter said, opening the door to reveal a clean but sparse bedroom. "Bathroom is shared with Lucia, the other assistant. Your uniforms are in the wardrobe." Elena nodded, hiding her relief at having somewhere to live. When her apartment building had been sold for redevelopment, finding affordable housing had become impossible. Change quickly. "I'll show you your duties afterward." Alone, Elena sank onto the narrow bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, better than the couch she'd been sleeping on at her cousin's crowded apartment for the past 3 weeks. She opened the wardrobe to find 3 identical black dresses with white aprons, simple but well-made. As she changed, her fingers brushed against the small pendant hidden beneath her blouse, a tiny silver piano her mother had given her for her 16th birthday. "Music will always find its way back to you," her mother had said. Elena swallowed the familiar lump in her throat and tucked the necklace safely under her uniform. Some dreams were better left in the past. 15 minutes later, Elena followed Mrs. Porter through the mansion. The head housekeeper pointed out rooms with rapid efficiency. "You'll be responsible for the east wing. 12 rooms including the library, sunroom, and guest bedrooms. Dusting daily. Full cleaning twice weekly. Windows every Thursday. Silver polishing on Mondays." Elena nodded, mentally mapping each room. The mansion was beautiful but felt strangely unlived in, like a museum where nothing was meant to be touched. "Mr. Reed entertains important guests frequently. During these occasions, you'll assist with service. Otherwise, you are to remain invisible. Mr. Reed values his privacy above all else." "I understand." "When will I meet Mr. Reed?" Elena asked. Mrs. Porter's thin lips tightened. "Mr. Reed rarely interacts with household staff. Consider yourself fortunate if you don't draw his attention." The warning in her voice was clear. After the tour, Elena was given a detailed schedule and left to begin her duties. The work was straightforward. She'd done similar tasks at the hotel, just on a larger scale and with more expensive items. By midday, she had cleaned 3 guest bedrooms and was starting on the library. The library was magnificent. 2 stories tall with a spiral staircase connecting the levels. Thousands of books filled the shelves, their leather bindings gleaming in the sunlight. Elena carefully dusted each shelf, occasionally running her fingers along the spines of books she'd only heard of but never had the chance to read. "Those are first editions," a cold voice said from behind her. Elena jumped, nearly dropping her duster. A tall man stood in the doorway, watching her with sharp, assessing eyes. Even without an introduction, she knew instantly this was Alexander Reed. His tailored suit probably cost more than she'd earn in months, and his posture radiated authority. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just dusting them." She lowered her eyes respectfully. He studied her for an uncomfortable moment. "You're new?" "Yes, sir." "Elena Vasquez. I started today." His gaze swept over her, impersonal and evaluating, like she was an appliance he was considering purchasing. "The Dickens collection is extremely valuable. Use the special cloth Mrs. Porter provides for them." "Not that?" He nodded toward her regular duster. "Of course, Mr. Reed, I'll get it right away." "See that you do." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Elena exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Later, during her brief lunch break, Lucia, the other household assistant, slid onto the bench beside her in the staff kitchen. "So you met the dragon," she said with a knowing smile. Lucia was around Elena's age, with friendly eyes and a quiet voice. "Is he always so cold?" "Intimidating." "Particular?" Lucia supplied. "Yes, always. But the pay is good and he's rarely here. Travels constantly for business." Mrs. Porter made it sound like he's terrifying. Lucia shrugged. "He's not cruel, just distant, demanding. Everything must be perfect. Never ask personal questions. Never linger when he enters a room. Simple rules, really." Elena nodded. She could handle distant and demanding. After what she'd been through, a boss who ignored her seemed like a blessing. The afternoon passed in a blur of polishing, vacuuming, and organizing. By 5 o'clock, Elena's back ached, but she felt satisfied with her work. She had one last room to check, a small parlor at the end of the east wing. The door was ajar, and as she approached, Elena heard Mrs. Porter speaking to someone inside. "Of course, Mr. Reed. The staff has been informed that the dinner on Friday is extremely important. The governor and several potential investors will be attending." "Ensure everything is flawless," came Mr. Reed's clipped response. "The Westmoreland deal depends on it." Elena hesitated, not wanting to interrupt. Through the crack in the door, she could see part of the room, and something that made her heart skip a beat. A grand piano stood by the window, sunlight glinting off its polished surface. Not just any piano, but a Steinway concert grand, similar to the one she'd played during her brief time at the conservatory. Before everything had fallen apart, she must have made some small sound because the conversation inside stopped abruptly. "Yes?" Mrs. Porter called sharply. Elena quickly composed herself. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I was coming to clean the parlor." Mrs. Porter appeared at the door. "You can do this room tomorrow. Mr. Reed is using it now." "Of course. I apologize for the intrusion." Elena backed away, but not before catching Mr. Reed's curious gaze from inside the room. That night, after finishing her duties, Elena lay on her bed thinking about the piano. She hadn't played in nearly 3 years, not since her mother's illness had forced her to leave school and take full-time work. Sometimes she would press her fingers against tabletops, playing silent melodies only she could hear. Sleep eluded her. Around midnight, she finally gave up and slipped out of her room. Perhaps a glass of water and a short walk would quiet her mind. The mansion was different at night. Shadows pooled in corners and moonlight streamed through the tall windows. Elena walked silently, careful not to wake anyone. Without planning to, she found herself in the east wing, standing outside the parlor door. The piano called to her like an old friend. She hesitated, hand on the doorknob. This was foolish. If caught, she might lose this job she so desperately needed. But the longing in her fingers had grown too strong to ignore. The parlor was empty, bathed in silver moonlight. The piano waited, lid closed, untouched. Elena approached it reverently, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface. When was the last time this beautiful instrument had been played? The layer of dust suggested it served more as decoration than anything else. Before she could reconsider, Elena sat on the bench and lifted the lid. The keys gleamed white and black in the moonlight, perfect and inviting. She positioned her hands, remembering her teacher's instructions from what felt like a lifetime ago. Gentle but confident. The piano responds to intention. Her fingers touched the keys and a soft chord filled the room. The sound was rich and perfectly tuned. Elena closed her eyes, letting muscle memory guide her through the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune, appropriate for this moonlit moment. The music flowed from her hands as if the 3-year gap had never existed. Each note awakened something inside her that had been dormant for too long. She played softly, mindful of the sleeping household, but with all the emotion she'd suppressed since setting aside her dreams. So lost was she in the music that she didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows by the door. Alexander Reed had been working late in his study when the distant sound of the piano had reached him. At first he'd assumed he was imagining things. No one used that piano. It had been his mother's, kept more as a memorial than an instrument. Curious and slightly irritated at the intrusion, he'd followed the sound to the parlor, prepared to reprimand whoever had dared to touch it. But the sight that greeted him made the words die in his throat. The new maid sat at the piano, her face transformed in the moonlight as her fingers created magic. The simple uniform couldn't hide the elegance of her posture, the trained precision of her hands. This was no amateur plinking at keys. This was an artist. He watched, unmoving, as she finished the piece, the final notes hanging in the air like a question. When Elena finally opened her eyes and looked up, she gasped. Mr. Reed stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, rising quickly from the bench. "I shouldn't have—" "Where did you learn to play like that?" he interrupted, his voice strangely quiet. Elena hesitated. "I studied at the National Conservatory for 2 years, sir. And now you're cleaning houses?" His question held genuine curiosity rather than the judgment she expected. "Life takes unexpected turns sometimes," she answered simply. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps. For a brief moment, the cold mask slipped, revealing something more human underneath. Then it was gone. "Don't touch the piano again without permission," he said, his voice returning to its usual clipped tone. "Good night, Ms. Vasquez." He turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing beside the piano, her heart racing with fear, embarrassment, and the faintest spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The week passed in a blur of routine for Elena. She scrubbed, polished, and organized with quiet efficiency, quickly earning Mrs. Porter's grudging approval. But no matter how busy her hands were, her mind kept returning to that moment in the piano room, and to Mr. Reed's unreadable expression when he'd caught her playing. She hadn't touched the piano since that night, though her fingers ached to. Sometimes, walking past the closed parlor door, she'd slow her steps, listening for any sound from within. The room remained silent, the beautiful Steinway gathering dust once more. "You've been avoiding the east parlor," Lucia observed one afternoon as they folded fresh linens together. "Did something happen?" Elena concentrated on aligning the corners of a pillowcase perfectly. "Mr. Reed caught me in there after hours." Lucia's eyes widened. "And you still have your job?" "What were you doing?" "Playing the piano," Elena admitted softly. "You play?" Lucia paused her folding. "Like actually play? Not just Mary had a little lamb stuff?" Elena shrugged, embarrassed. "I used to study it seriously." "Well, that explains it," Lucia said, resuming her work. "Explains what?" "Why he didn't fire you on the spot. Mr. Reed's mother was a pianist. Famous, I think. Though I don't know much about that world. There's a whole room of her records locked in the library." Elena absorbed this new information, remembering the strange look that had crossed Mr. Reed's face. Not just irritation at finding a servant touching his belongings, but something more personal. "How do you know about his mother?" Lucia lowered her voice. "The old gardener, Thomas. Been here 30 years. Says she was the only one who could soften Mr. Reed's father. A real tyrant, apparently. She died when Mr. Reed was in college. After that, he changed. Became more like his father." Their conversation ended abruptly as Mrs. Porter appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "The dinner party is tomorrow evening," she announced. "Elena, you and Lucia will assist with service. 7 guests, formal place settings. Everything must be perfect." After Mrs. Porter left, Lucia nudged Elena. "First big event. Nervous?" "A bit," Elena confessed. "Who are these people?" "The usual suspects. Rich business people, politicians. Mr. Reed only entertains when he wants something." Lucia's voice held no judgment, just matter-of-fact acceptance. "Wear the good uniform, the one with the better collar, and comfortable shoes. It'll be a long night." The next evening arrived with a flurry of activity. Florists delivered elaborate arrangements. Caterers commandeered the kitchen. Crystal glasses were inspected for the slightest smudges, and silverware was polished until it gleamed. Elena dressed carefully in her best uniform, securing her hair in a neat bun. As she fastened her mother's piano pendant beneath her collar for luck, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. These guests would be powerful people, One mistake could cost her this job she so desperately needed. "Remember," Mrs. Porter instructed as they prepared the dining room, "you are to be invisible. Anticipate needs before they're expressed. No rattling dishes. No interrupting conversations. Clear from the left, serve from the right." The guests began arriving at 7. From her position near the kitchen, Elena watched them enter. Men in expensive suits, women in elegant dresses, all wearing the easy confidence of wealth and power. Mr. Reed greeted each arrival with perfect courtesy, though Elena noticed his smile never quite reached his eyes. He looked striking in his tailored suit, moving with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. Lucia appeared at Elena's side. "That's the governor," she whispered, nodding toward a silver-haired man laughing too loudly at something Mr. Reed had said. "And the woman in the green dress is Vivian Chen, tech company CEO, richer than God." "Who's that?" Elena asked, indicating a stern-looking older man whose critical gaze seemed to find fault with everything it touched. "Harold Westmoreland. The main event, apparently. Old money, owns half the shipping industry on the West Coast. Mr. Reed's been trying to get him to invest in some new venture for months." Dinner service began smoothly. Elena moved around the table unobtrusively, filling water glasses and removing empty plates. The conversation flowed easily among the guests. Discussions of market trends, political connections, and vacation properties blending into a steady hum of privilege. Mr. Reed sat at the head of the table, guiding the conversation with subtle skill. To most, he would appear relaxed, but Elena noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers occasionally tightened around his wine glass when the conversation veered away from his intended direction. "The expansion into Asian markets is proceeding on schedule," he was saying to Westmoreland. "Our projections show a 30% increase in revenue within the first year." Westmoreland made a non-committal sound, cutting his steak with precise movements. "Projections are just educated guesses, Reed. I've seen too many ventures fail despite beautiful charts and enthusiastic presentations." A flicker of frustration crossed Mr. Reed's face, quickly masked. "Perhaps after dinner I could show you the latest reports from our test markets. The numbers speak for themselves." "Numbers can be manipulated," Westmoreland said dismissively. "I'm more interested in character. Show me something real about yourself, Reed. We've known each other for years, and I still can't say what drives you besides profit." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Elena, removing a plate from beside Westmoreland, held her breath. For a moment, Mr. Reed seemed at a loss. The governor, perhaps sensing tension, laughed too heartily. "Come now, Harold. Alexander's a businessman, not a performing monkey. What would you have him do, recite poetry?" "Actually," said Vivian Chen, swirling her wine thoughtfully, "I've always found that a person's relationship with art reveals more about them than any business proposal. Alexander, this house is beautiful, but strangely impersonal. Do you have any artistic interests at all?" Mr. Reed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I appreciate fine art, of course. My collection. Buying expensive paintings as investments doesn't count," Westmoreland interrupted. "Chen is asking what moves you. What do you care about beyond balance sheets?" The atmosphere grew tense. Elena, returning to the kitchen with empty dessert plates, could feel Mr. Reed's discomfort from across the room. He was losing control of the evening, and with it, possibly the business deal he clearly wanted. When she re-entered with coffee, the conversation had shifted to safer topics, but the undercurrent of Westmoreland's challenge lingered. Mr. Reed's eyes darted around the room as if seeking escape. And then, suddenly they locked on Elena. A strange expression crossed his face, like someone who has just remembered a forgotten weapon. "Actually," he said, cutting through the small talk, "I do have an appreciation for music. Classical piano specifically." Westmoreland raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You play?" "No," Mr. Reed admitted. "But I know talent when I hear it." Elena felt a chill run down her spine as Mr. Reed's gaze remained fixed on her. "In fact," he continued, "I recently discovered that one of my staff is quite accomplished. Perhaps a small demonstration would interest you all before we move to the library for brandy." The governor chuckled. "One of your staff? This should be amusing." Elena froze, coffee pot still in hand, as Mr. Reed turned fully toward her. "Ms. Vasquez, would you favor us with a piece on the piano?" The request, clearly a command, hung in the air. Elena's cheeks burned as every head at the table turned to stare at her. She saw various expressions, curiosity, amusement, and from Westmoreland, open skepticism. It's been some time since I played properly, sir, she managed to say. Nevertheless, Mr. Reed's voice was smooth but left no room for refusal. I'm sure you remember something suitable. Lucia appeared silently beside her, taking the coffee pot from her trembling hands. Elena stood rooted to the spot, humiliation washing over her. This was why he hadn't fired her after finding her at the piano. He'd been saving her for entertainment, for a party trick to impress his guests. She thought about refusing, about walking out. But the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills still weren't fully paid. Her cousin's couch awaited if she lost her room here. With as much dignity as she could muster, Elena nodded stiffly. As you wish, Mr. Reed. She felt the guest's eyes following her as she walked to the parlor adjoining the dining room. Her legs felt wooden, her hands cold. Behind her, she heard chairs scraping as everyone moved to follow. Someone, the governor, she thought, made a joke she couldn't quite hear, followed by polite laughter. The Steinway waited, lid already raised. Had Mr. Reed planned this all along? The thought made her stomach twist. She sat on the bench, acutely aware of her uniform, of her position, of the boundary being crossed. The guests arranged themselves around the room, drinks in hand, expressions ranging from boredom to mild curiosity. Mr. Reed stood nearest the piano, his eyes unreadable. Whenever you're ready, Miss Vasquez, he said, his tone suggesting he expected disappointment but was prepared to be polite about it. Elena looked down at the keys, seeing not ivory and ebony but her mother's face when she'd won her scholarship, the years of lessons they couldn't really afford. The sacrifices made for a dream that had seemed within reach before life intervened. She had been brought here to be humiliated, to be the help who presumed talent she didn't possess, to fail and provide an amusing anecdote for these people to share at their next gathering. Fine, let them watch. Elena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. She chose Chopin's Ballet No. 1 in G minor, a piece that began deceptively simply before building to emotional complexity. Her fingers found the keys with the certainty of muscle memory, the opening notes falling like gentle rain. For the first few measures, she was aware of everything, the slight resistance of the piano's action, the weight of the watching eyes, the constraint of her uniform. Then, as the music deepened, the world around her fell away. This wasn't about Mr. Reed or his guests anymore. This was about the girl who had once believed music would be her life, about her mother who had worked double shifts to pay for lessons, about dreams deferred but not destroyed. The piece grew more demanding, her hands flying across the keyboard as the melody built in intensity. She leaned into the fortissimo passages, drawing out the piano's full voice, no longer caring about being the perfect, invisible servant. She played with everything she had, everything she was, not for the approval of the watching wealthy, but for herself, for the truth of who she had been and still was beneath her uniform. As the final notes died away, Elena opened her eyes, breathing hard, her heart pounding. The room was utterly silent. No polite applause, no murmured compliments, just shock written across every face. Governor Wilson's mouth hung slightly open. Vivian Chen had set down her wine glass, her eyes wide. And Westmoreland, stern, critical Westmoreland, was staring at her with genuine surprise. But it was Mr. Reed's expression that struck her most. He stood rigid, his face pale, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. Not the smugness of someone whose party trick had succeeded, but the stunned look of a person who has miscalculated badly and now doesn't know how to proceed. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Westmoreland turned to Mr. Reed. Well, he said quietly, it seems you've been hiding more than market projections, Alexander. The room erupted in applause, breaking the spell. As guests crowded around the piano with questions and compliments, Elena caught Mr. Reed's eye again. He looked away first, turning abruptly to answer something Vivian Chen had asked him, but not before Elena saw it. The conflicted recognition of someone who had intended harm, but created something unexpected instead. Someone who had sought to humiliate but instead had been humbled, and in that moment, the balance of power between them shifted ever so slightly. The morning after the dinner party, Elena woke early, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. The faces of the astonished guests, the unexpected applause, and most of all, Mr. Reed's expression, that unguarded moment when his plan to humiliate her had backfired so completely. She dressed for work with careful movements, wondering what consequences awaited her. Would he fire her for outshining him, for making his attempt at mockery turn into something else entirely, or would he simply pretend nothing had happened? When she stepped into the kitchen for breakfast, conversation immediately died. The other staff members, the cook, the gardener, and Lucia, all turned to stare at her. "What?" Elena asked, reaching for a coffee mug. Thomas, the elderly gardener, broke into a wide grin. "Our little pianist." "Why didn't you tell us?" Lucia shook her head in disbelief. "Elena, the whole house is talking about it. Mrs. Porter said Mr. Westmoreland stayed an extra hour after the other guests left, and they signed some huge contract. Apparently, he was impressed by the cultural sensitivity of the evening." "Cultural sensitivity?" Elena repeated, confused. "That's what Mr. Reed called it," the cook said with a snort. "Like he planned the whole thing as some kind of sophisticated entertainment, not just putting you on the spot." Elena felt a flicker of anger. Of course he would take credit, spinning his impulsive cruelty into calculated brilliance. "Well, whatever his reasons," Lucia said. "Mrs. Porter's in a good mood for once. The dinner was a success, though—" She hesitated. "Though what?" "Mr. Reed left very early this morning. Business trip, apparently. Sudden. He's not expected back until next week." Elena wasn't sure if she felt relieved or disappointed. Part of her had been preparing for a confrontation, for the chance to look him in the eye after what had happened. Another part was grateful for the reprieve. The days passed quietly. Elena continued her duties, finding comfort in the routine of polishing silver and arranging fresh flowers. Several times she caught Mrs. Porter watching her with an odd expression, not the usual critical assessment, but something closer to curiosity. On Thursday afternoon, Elena was dusting the library shelves when Mrs. Porter appeared in the doorway. "I need to speak with you," the head housekeeper said, her voice giving away nothing. Elena followed her to the small office where staff schedules and household accounts were managed. Mrs. Porter closed the door and sat behind her desk, gesturing for Elena to take the chair opposite. "It has come to my attention," she began formally, "that your skills extend beyond household management." Elena waited, hands folded in her lap. "Mr. Reed has left instructions regarding your duties." Mrs. Porter slid a folded note across the desk. "This arrived by courier this morning." With hesitant fingers, Elena opened the note. The handwriting was bold and precise, much like the man himself. "Mrs. Porter, please adjust Ms. Vasquez's schedule to include 2 hours of piano practice daily. The East Parlor is to be made available to her from 2 to 4 p.m. Her other duties should be redistributed accordingly. Additionally, ensure the piano tuner attends to the Steinway this week." Elena read the note twice, her confusion growing. This wasn't at all what she had expected. "I don't understand," she finally said. Mrs. Porter's expression softened slightly. "Neither do I, to be honest. In 30 years, I've never known Mr. Reed to take a personal interest in any staff member. This isn't—" Elena struggled to find the words. "Personal?" Mrs. Porter supplied, raising an eyebrow. "No, I don't believe it is. Mr. Reed doesn't form personal attachments easily. But he does recognize value, and apparently your musical ability has value to him. For what? More dinner parties? More showing off the talented servant?" Elena couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Mrs. Porter studied her for a moment. "You're angry with him." It wasn't a question, but Elena answered anyway. "He tried to humiliate me. He put me on display like some curiosity." "Yes," Mrs. Porter agreed simply. "He did. And now he's offering you time to practice your art during working hours while still receiving full pay." She tapped the note. "People are complicated, Ms. Vasquez, even difficult ones like Alexander Reed." Elena left the office with more questions than answers. As she walked through the quiet hallways of the mansion, she found herself heading toward the East Parlor. The door was open, sunlight streaming across the gleaming piano. She approached it slowly, trailing her fingers along the polished wood. This instrument that had once been meant to mock her was now being offered as What, an apology? A bribe or something else entirely? At precisely 2 p.m., Elena sat down at the piano. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to play freely without fear or constraint. The music filled the room, echoing through the empty mansion, scales and exercises at first, then favorite pieces, then improvisations that spoke of loss and hope and cautious possibility. When 4 o'clock came, she reluctantly closed the lid and returned to her regular duties, feeling more alive than she had in years. The pattern continued for the next few days. Elena cleaned and organized in the mornings, played in the afternoons, and completed her remaining tasks in the evenings. The piano tuner came, an elderly man who nodded approvingly after hearing her play a few measures. "Good hands," he'd said simply, respectful of the instrument. By the time Mr. Reed's return approached, Elena had settled into the new routine, her fingers regaining strength and flexibility, her confidence growing with each practice session. What she hadn't expected was how word would spread beyond the mansion walls. It began with a phone call from Vivian Chen's personal assistant, inquiring if Elena would be willing to play at a small gathering the following month. Then came a message from the governor's wife, asking about piano lessons for their granddaughter. "They're treating you like you're some kind of professional," Lucia observed as they folded laundry together. "I was once," Elena said quietly. "Or I was going to be anyway." "What happened?" Lucia asked. Elena rarely spoke about her past, but something about the events of the past week had loosened the tight grip she kept on those memories. "My mother got sick during my second year at the conservatory. Cancer. The medical bills." She shrugged. "I had to drop out, get a full-time job. After she died, there were still debts to pay. By then, going back didn't seem possible." Lucia squeezed her hand briefly. "But you never stopped being a musician?" "I stopped playing," Elena corrected. "For 3 years I didn't touch a piano. Not until that night here." "Well," Lucia said practically, "you're playing now, and people with money and influence are noticing. That's not nothing." The night of Mr. Reed's return, Elena found herself lingering in the east parlor after her practice time had ended. The mansion felt different knowing he was back, the air charged with an expectancy she couldn't quite name. She was replacing the cover on the piano when she heard footsteps in the doorway. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Something about his particular stride, measured and deliberate, had become familiar to her. "You've been using it regularly," Mr. Reed observed. Elena turned to face him. He looked tired, the usual sharp lines of his appearance slightly softened by travel fatigue. For a moment, neither spoke. "Yes," she finally said. "Thank you for the opportunity." He nodded, his eyes moving from her to the piano and back again. "The tuner says you have excellent technique." "I had good teachers." Another silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. "Why did you do it?" Elena finally asked, unable to contain the question any longer. "At the dinner." "Why put me in that position?" Mr. Reed's expression tightened. He moved further into the room, his hands in his pockets, a gesture that seemed oddly vulnerable coming from him. "It was wrong," he said simply. "I saw an opportunity to impress a difficult client, and I used you to do it." The admission surprised her. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger at being questioned by an employee. Not this direct acknowledgement. Then why this? She gestured to the piano. "The practice time? The tuner?" He looked away, his gaze fixing on something outside the window. "My mother was a pianist," he said after a pause. "Quite talented, though she gave up performing when she married my father." This was her piano. Elena remembered what Lucia had told her, about his mother being the only one who could soften his father. "After she died, I kept it tuned, but no one played it. It seemed a waste." He turned back to her, his expression carefully neutral. "Your talent deserves cultivation. That's all." But there was something else in his eyes, something that suggested this simple explanation wasn't the whole truth. "I've received requests," Elena said, "from your guests. Mrs. Chen wants me to play at an event and the governor's wife asked about lessons." A flash of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked. "And how do you feel about that?" The question caught her off guard. How did she feel? No one had asked her that in a long time, certainly not her employer. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "A month ago I thought that part of my life was over. Now, now it doesn't have to be. He finished for her. Their eyes met, and for a moment Elena glimpsed something unexpected in his, a recognition, perhaps even a kinship. Here was a man who had also set aside something essential to himself, who had become defined by practicality and ambition rather than passion. "I have connections at the symphony," Mr. Reed said suddenly. "People who could help you if you wanted to pursue music professionally again." Elena stared at him, trying to understand the abrupt offer. "Why would you do that?" He seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because talent shouldn't be wasted. Because—" He hesitated, searching for words that didn't come easily to him. "Because I made a mistake, trying to use your ability for my own purposes. This would be a correction." The word hung between them. Not quite an apology, but something close. "I have a job," Elena pointed out. "Here, jobs can be changed." They regarded each other across the room, both aware of some shift in the atmosphere between them. Not exactly friendship, not precisely understanding, but a mutual recognition, two people seeing each other clearly for the first time. "Think about it," Mr. Reed said, moving toward the door. "There's no rush to decide." He paused at the threshold, turning back. For a brief moment his formal demeanor slipped, revealing something almost like uncertainty. "Would you—" He cleared his throat. "Would you play something now? Not for guests or business associates, just because you can." The request held no command this time, no ulterior motive that Elena could detect. Just a simple desire to hear music in a quiet room as evening fell. Without a word, she sat back down at the piano, adjusted the bench, and began to play. Not Chopin or Debussy this time, but a simpler piece, a folk melody her mother had loved, transformed through her own improvisation into something both familiar and new. As the music filled the room, Elena caught a glimpse of Mr. Reed's reflection in the window glass. He had closed his eyes, his usual rigid posture softening as the melody washed over him. In that unguarded moment, she saw not the cold tycoon who had sought to humiliate her, but a man carrying his own private burdens, finding momentary respite in beauty he hadn't expected, and in the gentle notes rising from the piano, two separate paths began imperceptibly to bend toward one another. The weeks that followed brought subtle but significant changes to life at Reed Manor. Elena continued her dual role as household assistant and pianist, her daily practice sessions now an established part of the routine. What had begun as an unexpected accommodation had evolved into something more meaningful, a rekindling of passion long set aside. Mrs. Chen's gathering came and went, with Elena performing a carefully selected program of classical pieces for an appreciative audience of wealthy arts patrons. She had worn a borrowed dress rather than her uniform, and for those 2 hours had been introduced not as Mr. Reed's employee but simply as Elena Vasquez, pianist. The governor's wife's granddaughter had begun weekly lessons, arriving each Wednesday afternoon with wide eyes and clumsy fingers. Teaching brought Elena unexpected joy, the girl's determination reminding her of her own childhood struggles with difficult passages. Throughout it all, Mr. Reed remained a distant but watchful presence. Their interactions were brief, polite, with an undercurrent of something neither seemed ready to name. Sometimes he would appear silently in the doorway during her practice sessions, listening for a few minutes before continuing on his way. Other times he would leave music scores on the piano, challenging pieces she'd mentioned wanting to learn. One evening, as Elena was finishing a particularly difficult Rachmaninoff prelude, she sensed movement behind her. She had grown accustomed to Mr. Reed's quiet appearances, but this time, when she turned, she found him standing closer than usual, his expression thoughtful. "The symphony board is meeting next week," he said without preamble. "I've spoken to the artistic director about you." Elena's hand stilled on the keys. "Oh?" "They're holding auditions for their young artists program. It's competitive, but—" He hesitated. "He agreed to hear you play." Elena felt her heart rate quicken. The young artist program was prestigious, a pathway for promising musicians to transition into professional careers. Before her mother's illness, it had been one of her dreams. "I haven't prepared for auditions," she said, her voice small against the enormity of what he was suggesting. "I've been away from serious study for years." "You've been practicing intensively for months now," he countered, "and you have natural talent that training alone can't provide." Why are you doing this? The question escaped before she could stop it. Mr. Reed's gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. Because sometimes people need a second chance. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old regret. Not everyone gets one. Before she could respond, he turned to leave. At the door, he paused. The audition is Tuesday at 2. I've already arranged for you to have the day off. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. It's your choice, of course. Long after he'd gone, Elena sat at the piano, her thoughts in turmoil. The possibility he'd presented shimmered before her, tantalizing, frightening. To return to the path she'd abandoned, to reclaim the dream she'd set aside. But dreams had sharp edges. She remembered the crushing disappointment when she'd withdrawn from the conservatory, the pitying looks, the carefully worded letters deferring her scholarship, the gradual acceptance that some doors once closed remained so forever. Did she dare hope again? That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She slipped out of her room and walked the familiar path to the east parlor. The house was quiet, moonlight streaming through tall windows and casting long shadows across the floors. The piano waited, patient and unchanging. Elena sat on the bench not to play but simply to think. Her fingers traced the cool keys without pressing them, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. You're up late. The voice startled her. Mr. Reed stood in the doorway, his usual impeccable appearance softened by casual clothes, dark trousers and a simple sweater. He looked younger somehow, less formidable. So are you, she replied. He entered the room, moving to stand by the window. I don't sleep well most nights. The admission surprised her. It was the most personal thing he'd ever shared with her. Neither do I, Elena said. Not lately. A silence fell between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Are you considering the audition? He finally asked. I don't know. Elena's honesty surprised even her. Part of me wants to, so much, but another part is afraid, of failing, of hoping. She looked up at him. Hope can hurt more than failure sometimes. Something in his expression shifted, a momentary vulnerability crossing his face. Yes, he agreed quietly. It can. In that moment, Elena felt the distance between employer and employee thin, replaced by a simpler connection. Two people who understood loss, who had learned to live within safe boundaries rather than risk further pain. May I ask you something? She ventured. He nodded. Your mother's piano. All these years, why did you keep it? If no one played it? Mr. Reed moved closer to the instrument, his hand brushing its polished surface with unexpected tenderness. She used to play every evening, he said, his voice distant with memory. No matter how busy the day had been, no matter what arguments had happened at dinner. For 1 hour there was just music. He paused. After she died, the house felt empty without it. But you never learned to play yourself? A wry smile touched his lips. My father considered music a suitable accomplishment for women, but a distraction for men. Especially men who were expected to take over the family business. And you accepted that? At the time, his gaze met hers. We often accept limitations in youth that we question later in life. The words hung between them, resonating with Elena's own experience. She thought of her abandoned studies, of the practical choices that had seemed inevitable at the time. The audition, she began hesitantly. If I were to try, and if I were accepted, I couldn't continue working here full-time. I'm aware. I would need to find another job, something with flexible hours, and affordable housing. Mr. Reed studied her, his expression unreadable. Are these practical concerns or reasons to avoid trying? The question struck her like a physical blow. Was she creating obstacles to protect herself from disappointment? From the risk of reaching for something she wanted? Both, maybe, she admitted. He nodded, accepting her honesty without judgment. If those are your only concerns, solutions can be found. Part-time work is possible. The staff quarters would remain available to you. He spoke matter-of-factly, as if offering simple business arrangements rather than potentially life-changing accommodations. Why would you do that? Elena asked, genuinely puzzled. I'm just your housekeeper. For a moment, Mr. Reed seemed at a loss for words. He paused, reformulating his thoughts. What you've brought back to this house, the music, the life in these rooms, it has value beyond your duties as staff. Something in his careful phrasing made Elena wonder what he'd originally intended to say. There was an intensity in his gaze that suggested deeper currents beneath his composed exterior. "I should let you get some rest," he said abruptly, moving toward the door. "The decision about Tuesday is yours, of course. Either way, your place here is secure." After he left, Elena remained at the piano, his words echoing in her mind. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to genuinely consider a different future. One where music took center stage again, where passion wasn't sacrificed to practicality. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Her fingers found the keys and she began to play softly. Not a classical piece this time, but a simple melody her mother had taught her when she was very young. A lullaby about dreams and courage and the light that waits beyond darkness. By morning, her decision was made. Tuesday arrived bright and clear. Elena had selected her pieces carefully. Bach to demonstrate technique, Chopin to show emotional depth, and a contemporary piece to prove versatility. She had practiced until her fingers ached, then practiced more. Mrs. Porter had surprised her with the loan of a simple but elegant outfit, a dark blue dress that had belonged to her niece. Lucia had helped style her hair. Even Thomas the gardener had contributed, cutting a single perfect rose for her to carry for luck. As Elena prepared to leave for the audition, she found Mr. Reed waiting by the car that would take her to the symphony hall. "You don't need to drive me," she said, confused by his presence. "I'm not." He straightened his tie, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "But I thought, that is, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to attend. As an observer." The request caught her completely off guard. "You want to come to my audition?" "Only if it wouldn't disturb your concentration," he added quickly. "I understand if you'd prefer to go alone." Elena studied him, trying to understand this man who had first tried to humiliate her, then offered her opportunity, and now wanted to witness her potential triumph or failure. His expression gave little away, but there was something in his eyes, a hesitant question, a careful hope. "I would like that," she said finally. "Thank you." The drive to the symphony hall passed in comfortable silence. Elena's thoughts turned inward, focusing on the music, on the feeling she wanted to convey. Mr. Reed respected her need for mental preparation, asking no questions, making no small talk. When they arrived, the imposing building with its columns and grand entrance brought back a rush of memories for Elena. Similar halls where she had performed as a student. The mixture of terror and exhilaration before stepping onto a stage. In the lobby, Mr. Reed stepped aside to speak with a gray-haired man who greeted him with obvious respect. Elena caught fragments of their conversation. "Exceptional talent and unusual circumstances, and worth your time, I promise." The artistic director, she realized. Alexander Reed was using his influence to ensure she got a fair hearing. Ms. Vasquez, a young woman with a clipboard, approached. "We're ready for you now." Elena took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. As she moved toward the audition room, she felt a light touch on her arm. "Elena." Mr. Reed rarely used her first name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her pause. "Whatever happens in there, remember why you play." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, conveying something beyond encouragement, a recognition, perhaps, of the shared understanding that had grown between them. Then he stepped back, nodding slightly. "I'll be listening," he said simply. The audition room was smaller than she'd expected, a chamber with excellent acoustics rather than the main hall. A panel of 5 judges sat behind a table, their expressions professionally neutral. A magnificent grand piano waited at the center. Elena approached it with reverence, adjusting the bench to her height, settling her music scores though she knew the pieces by heart. Her hands trembled slightly as she introduced herself. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'll be playing Bach's Prelude in C minor, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and Einaudi's Experience." She caught sight of Mr. Reed slipping quietly into a seat at the back of the room, his presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. Then she turned to the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. For a moment, everything else fell away, the judges, the pressure, even Mr. Reed. There was only Elena and the music waiting to be born under her fingers. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices made for her education, of the path abandoned and now perhaps reclaimed, and she began to play. The Bach flowed perfectly, her technical precision shining through the complex counterpoint. The Chopin breathed with emotion, each note infused with the bittersweet journey that had brought her to this moment. And the Einaudi built like a wave, carrying her forward into possibility. As the final notes of experience faded into silence, Elena opened her eyes. The judges were whispering among themselves, making notes. She couldn't read their expressions. Then from the back of the room came the sound of a single person applauding. Mr. Reed had risen to his feet, his usually guarded face transformed by something that looked remarkably like pride. And in that moment, regardless of the judge's decision, Elena knew she had already reclaimed something precious, not just her music, but the courage to hope again. The ride back from the symphony hall passed in a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Elena sat quietly in the passenger seat, her mind replaying every moment of the audition. The judge's intent expressions, the feel of the magnificent piano beneath her fingers, and the brief, whispered conference after her performance. 2 weeks, the artistic director had said. We'll have our decision in 2 weeks. But Ms. Vasquez... He'd paused, his professional demeanor softening slightly. That was quite remarkable for someone who hasn't performed seriously in years. Now, as the car glided through the evening traffic, Elena found herself stealing glances at Mr. Reed. He drove with the same precise focus he brought to everything, his profile illuminated by the dashboard lights. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the hall. He seemed to understand her need to process what had happened. You played beautifully, he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. Especially the Chopin. Thank you. Elena looked down at her hands, still feeling the aftershocks of adrenaline in her fingertips. For everything. Not just today, but for making it possible. Mr. Reed glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. I simply provided an opportunity. What you did with it was entirely your own achievement. Still, not many employers would do what you've done. A slight smile touched his lips. I'm beginning to think our employer-employee relationship has evolved beyond conventional definitions. The words hung between them, carrying implications neither seemed ready to examine too closely. When they arrived back at Reed Manor, Mrs. Porter, Lucia, and even Thomas were waiting in the kitchen, eager for news. Their genuine excitement touched Elena deeply. These people who had been mere colleagues months ago had become something like family. They'll decide in 2 weeks, she told them, accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Porter pressed into her hands. The director seemed positive, but she shrugged, not wanting to assume too much. Of course he was positive, Lucia said confidently. He'd be a fool not to accept you. Did Mr. Reed speak with him? Mrs. Porter asked, her practical mind going straight to influence and connections. Elena shook her head. He didn't interfere. He just watched and listened. Her gaze drifted to the doorway where Mr. Reed had paused briefly before continuing to his study. Their eyes had met for a moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before he'd moved on, leaving her to her small celebration with the staff. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down and the house had grown quiet, Elena found herself drawn once more to the east parlor. The piano called to her, not for practice this time, but for the pure joy of playing without pressure or purpose. She was halfway through an improvised melody when she sensed him behind her. Without stopping her playing, she shifted slightly on the bench, making room. After a moment's hesitation, Mr. Reed sat beside her. They remained that way for several minutes, Elena playing softly, Mr. Reed listening, their shoulders nearly touching in the shared space. There was an intimacy to the moment that should have felt uncomfortable but somehow didn't. My mother used to let me sit beside her sometimes, he said quietly, on nights when my father was away on business. Elena's hand slowed but didn't stop. What did she play? Debussy was her favorite. She said his music reminded her of water and light. A distant look came into his eyes. My father preferred Bach, structure, precision. He'd have her play it when guests were over. And what do you prefer? Elena asked. He considered the question seriously. I prefer watching someone play what moves them, whatever that might be. His gaze held hers, and Elena felt something shift between them, a boundary becoming permeable, a distance closing. The symphony program, she said, changing the subject before the moment could become too weighted. If I'm accepted, it would be a significant commitment. Rehearsals, performances, continued private study. I understand. I'd need to adjust my work here considerably. He nodded. We already discussed that possibility. Solutions can be found. It's strange, Elena admitted. A few months ago, I thought my life was set on one path. Now everything might change. Change can be challenging, Mr. Reed said carefully, but necessary. For growth. Something in his tone made Elena wonder if he was speaking of more than her situation. Alexander. She used his first name deliberately, testing this new, undefined territory between them. Why did you really help me? The truth this time. He looked down at the piano keys, running one finger lightly along them without pressing down. When I first heard you play, he began slowly, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Something important. He paused, searching for words. My life has been efficient, successful by most measures, but somehow hollow in ways I hadn't allowed myself to recognize. Elena waited, giving him space to continue. Your music brought something back to this house that had been missing since my mother died. Not just sound, but... He gestured vaguely, a man unaccustomed to discussing emotions, struggling to articulate something essential. Life, feeling. His eyes met hers again. I tried to use your talent for my own purposes that night at dinner. But in the end, it was your gift that changed something in me, not the other way around. The honesty of his words touched Elena deeply. This wasn't the cold, calculating businessman who had once seemed to view her as merely a useful object. This was a man coming to terms with his own humanity, rediscovering parts of himself long suppressed. Thank you for telling me that, she said softly. For a moment longer, they sat together in comfortable silence. Then Mr. Reed rose, straightening his jacket in that characteristic gesture of his. It's getting late, he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. You should rest. But as he turned to leave, he added, whatever the symphony decides, Elena, your music has already made a difference. The 2 weeks of waiting passed both quickly and impossibly slowly. Elena continued her duties and her practice, trying not to count the days. Mr. Reed traveled for business, returning only occasionally. When he was home, their interactions were cordial but somewhat reserved, as if both were hesitant to disturb the delicate understanding they had reached. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, the letter arrived. Elena stared at the symphony's embossed logo on the envelope, her heart pounding. Mrs. Porter had brought it to her room personally. Her usually stern face softened with anticipation. Would you like privacy? The older woman asked. Elena shook her head. No, Is Mr. Reed here? In his study. Shall I tell him? Please. Moments later, Mr. Reed appeared in her doorway, his expression questioning. The letter came? Elena nodded, still holding the unopened envelope. I'm afraid to look. He entered the room, stopping a respectful distance away. Would you like me to read it first? She considered the offer, then shook her head. No, I need to do this myself. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the formal greeting, moving rapidly down to the paragraph that would determine her future. We are pleased to inform you. A small sound escaped her, something between a laugh and a sob. She looked up, eyes shining. I got in. They accepted me. The smile that transformed Mr. Reed's face was unlike any expression she had seen from him before. Open, genuinely delighted, without reservation or calculation. Of course they did, he said simply. Later that afternoon, a proper celebration was arranged. The kitchen staff prepared a special dinner, and Mr. Reed opened a bottle of champagne from his private cellar. It was the first time Elena could remember all of them, employer and employees, sharing a meal together as equals. As twilight fell, Elena slipped away to the east parlor. The piano where everything had begun waited, bathed in the golden light of sunset. She sat at the bench, letting her fingers rest lightly on the keys without pressing them. So much had changed in such a short time. The path ahead was exciting but daunting. Classes to attend, techniques to relearn, a new balance to find between her work at the manor and her commitment to music. Planning your first symphony program already? Mr. Reed stood in the doorway, champagne glass still in hand. He looked more relaxed than usual, the formality that typically defined him softened by the evening celebration. Just thinking, Elena said, about where I was when I first came here, about how different things are now. He crossed to stand beside the piano. Any regrets? No, she answered truthfully. Some fears about what comes next, but no regrets. He nodded, understanding. The program starts next month? Yes, 15 hours a week to begin with, plus practice time. We'll arrange your schedule here accordingly. Perhaps Lucia can take on some additional responsibilities. The practical discussion of arrangements felt comforting, a solid foundation beneath the more emotional aspects of the day. I've been thinking, Mr. Reed said after a pause. The piano. My mother's piano. It deserves to be played regularly by someone who understands it. Elena looked up at him, uncertain where he was going with this. I'd like you to consider it yours, he continued. Not just to use, but to own. Alexander, I can't accept. Please, he interrupted gently. It's been silent too long. And this house. He glanced around the room, his expression thoughtful. This house needs music. Even when you're busy with your symphony commitments. The offer touched her deeply. Thank you. But I don't think the piano should leave this room. It belongs here. A smile touched his lips. I agree. The implication hung in the air between them, that she too belonged here in some capacity neither could quite define yet. Not just as an employee, not merely as a pianist, but as something more. I should tell you, Mr. Reed said, his tone becoming more serious. I've made some decision.